let's edit a landscape photo in Lightroom. Poor old Lightroom's been feeling a little bit left out recently with a lot of my photo editing shifting over to Luminar. So in this one I'm bringing back Lightroom and I'm going to take you along for a complete walkthrough of my workflow while I edit this sunset landscape photo. We'll merge the bracketed shots together, I'll then do the global adjustments, and then we'll refine things with some custom masking using Lightroom's very cool new masking tools. And then we'll finish things off with a couple of my favourite approaches for colour grading. And if, like me, you're a stickler for having the absolute best image quality, perhaps even if you don't have the best camera gear, stick around till the end because I'll be sharing my little secret of basically where I send all of my images through the pipeline before they go off to print. But for now, let's load up Lightroom Classic and get into the editing. So this beautiful sunset here on the west coast of New Zealand actually caught me off guard. I didn't have my tripod with me and I knew that a sunset was going to have such a high dynamic range, i.e. the difference between the very brightest part, the sun, and the very darkest parts was going to be too great for my sensor on my camera to capture. Even though I'm shooting on a very nice camera with a good dynamic range, it just wasn't going to be enough. And so staying as still as I could, I rattled off these 5 images. We have the base exposure, we have one that is 2 stops darker, 1 stop darker, and then 1 brighter, and then one that is 2 stops brighter. And between the 5 images, we are going to get the best of both worlds. So if I come to my very darkest image here, that you can see I shot at 1/160th of a second, we have all the rich color information that we need around the very brightest highlights of the setting sun. And if I come over to this side, you can see that the shadows are basically unusable in this version. So the sun's great, but the rest of the photo is looking pretty poor. Whereas if I come to my very brightest exposure, you can see here that the sun is completely overexposed. We've lost all of that detail through here, and even if I try and drop the exposure down by 2 stops on this raw photo, you'll see that the color information just isn't there around the sun, and so you get all this nasty banding, not a true color representation. So I'll just reset that, but over here on the left hand side you can see that we do actually have information in our shadows to use. And so I'm going to use Lightroom's very clever HDR merge tool. Sure, it's no Aurora, but it's pretty good for what it is. It's pretty basic, but it does a pretty good job. So you just come up to photo merge with all of your photos selected and go merge to HDR, and then that's going to load the photos, and hopefully your preview will pop up here and you'll get a success message saying 5 images successfully merged, or however many images you're wanting to merge. Now we've got very few options here and they're really simple. Basically auto align, you want that ticked if you're not shooting on a tripod, because that's going to correct for any slight movements in your camera. And the second one is auto settings, and that is just going to allow Lightroom to make a suggestion as to how it thinks the photo should be processed. So if I turn this off, we can see what this merged DNG file will look like without any of those auto settings. Sometimes it's worth just turning this on just to give yourself a little kickstarter from Lightroom, even though you might be changing it slightly. The deghosting amount is really important if you've got any elements of your photo that might be moving. So in our case, we've got the sea that's moving, we've got maybe trees over here which might be swaying in the wind, that sort of thing. So if you have slight movement, stick with low. If you've got things that are moving quite aggressively, turn that on high. This may be worth just playing around with, but I normally find that the low setting works well enough for me in most situations. The show deghost overlay literally just shows you the areas where you're going to have the deghosting taken care of, and that area obviously grows if you select high or medium, but as I say, low is normally enough. And with create stack checked, when we click OK, our new high dynamic range photo is spat out by Lightroom, ready for us to work on, and the other 5 are now stacked underneath it here. And you can now see that we've got all the data that we need to work with in terms of the highlights and the shadows as well. So let's jump over to the develop module and get into the edit. Look, I'm going to reset this. I know I said you can leave those edits on from Lightroom, and straight away you can see that we've actually had an auto crop done, and the white border around our merged photo is just showing where the individual layers, the individual photos had to be reshifted to align them. And literally I'm going to come back in and recrop this. Now I don't want to be working on the standard 2:3 ratio that this was shot at, so I'm going to choose my own custom ratio, which is a 2:1, and I sell my prints as 2:1 canvas prints, and I find they sell very well in this panoramic format. If I click outside of this crop area here, I get a more refined grid, and I can just check that my horizon is nice and straight, and it is. So I'm quite pleased with that considering I handheld this shot. I could bring this up so that our sun is bang on that third point, but I think a crop like this is slightly better. Let's go with that. Now the first thing I'll always do is make sure that my profile is not a generic profile, but something that actually matches my camera. So I'm going to choose camera neutral or camera flat. Basically, they're very flat profiles, and it allows me the control of actually adding that contrast in. If I go for camera standard, for example, you can think, oh, that's much better, much more contrast, much richer. But no, I don't want that. I want to control my contrast myself. So camera flat is actually a really good place to start with your edits. Before I start any edit, I always like to have an idea of what I'm trying to achieve, and sure, I can take deviations from that because after all it is an organic, artistic process, but at least having an idea that guides you is a good idea. So for me, I see a lot of detail in the sky, and if I grab the clarity slider and just push that up, you can see that too. So I would actually like to reveal some of this detail in the cloud just to add more interest to the photo. I also like the highlight on the water here, but I kind of feel like the rest of this water on the left hand side, this is actually a river that's actually coming in to meet the ocean here. On the left hand side here, it's very flat, not much intrigue, and so I would actually like to make more of these highlights actually appear out here, and I'm going to show you how we can do that by using the masking feature inside of Lightroom. Adding a little more glow to the sun around here might be interesting, and I'd also like to keep our viewers' attention around the center of the frame here as well. So they're things that I will keep in mind as I progress along with my edit. So the first thing I'm going to do is just grab the temperature slider and just move it from right to left, and just have a little play around with this and just see whether there's a temperature that I feel is a better starting point. And I'll do the same with the tint as well, and I'll just grab that and just see whether the color tint needs to be shifted in any way. So I'm now going to make some changes to the tone and the presence sections just on a global scale with my photo, and then I'm going to come in and be much more refined and work with the masking section. So first things first, let's look at our exposure and see where we want the overall exposure of this photo to sit. Now I really like this kind of dark, brooding look. It really has a lot of drama about it when you reduce the exposure. However, I want this to go on my print site for people to actually buy this print, and I don't think many people are going to buy a very big dark canvas to go up on their wall, and so I am going to keep it brighter. I might just stay with the exposure at 0 for now. Now the contrast is definitely going to want to be increased, but normally I would prefer to actually start working with my whites and my blacks so that I can control the ends of the histogram here to make sure that we have a pure white point, which we do at the moment, which is the sun here, and also a pure black point. And if you're not sure if you're getting a pure black or not, just click that little triangle in the top left of the histogram. You can do the same for the highlights as well, and it will just give you a little warning. See how the sun went red there? Well, we can get a blue from any shadows that start to clip, as you can see there. And so I can take this to the right or the left and just fine tune that to a point where I just start to see black pixels appear, and I know that they are pure black, and everything above that is within the gamut of the visible histogram. So just by moving the white and the black, we have introduced contrast, but now we can come back and perhaps just add a little bit more with the actual contrast slider. I'm going to drop the highlights slightly just to protect this area in here, and now I'll grab the shadows and just see if we want to add a little bit more detail into the rest of the photo. Yeah, let's boost those up. Now I showed you before that I wanted to add some clarity into the sky. Now I'll bring this up and you can see that we can certainly add some more overall texture into the image by raising that clarity, but I don't want to do it over the whole photo. I don't like the look of it on the sea. I find the sea's getting a little bit too crunchy. We've also pushed our blacks too far now on the foliage on the landmass, so I'm just going to bring this back down and maybe just introduce around that sort of 24 mark. That's fine. Now the �値𝗧 slider, this is possibly going to do some weird things. If I take that all the way to the right and all the way to the left, you can see that it's really affecting the color balance of this photo, and it's worth playing around with this, particularly with landscape photos, because taking the �値𝗧s into negative territory can actually be a really interesting look to your photo. The same by introducing it as well, but on this one, I think we'll just add just a tiny bit of �値𝗧s, and that's just adding a little bit more local contrast and making those colors pop a little bit too. Talking of colour pop, let's push the vibrance up. Let's see how far we can take that before it starts looking real ugly. Okay, we can go pretty high with that. Probably not as far with the saturation. Yeah, I don't want to overcook this too much, but I certainly want to bring out this rich sunset that I was witnessing while I was there with my own eyes. Okay, so far so good. Let's jump into the tone curve and have a little play around here. The tone curve is one of my favorite tools in any photo editor, whether it's Lightroom, Luminar, Photoshop, whatever. I love the tone curve tool. So here I can boost up the midtones, and if I want to, I can add an S curve and introduce more contrast, perhaps not as heavy with the shadows. And we could do some interesting color grading if we wanted to as well. We could push the highlights more into a yellow and the shadows into a blue. And I do love doing this effect, but at the moment I don't want to do any color grading until I've done my local adjustments. And so this is where I'm going to leave things for the global edit. And now I'm going to come into some more precise refinements. And the first thing I've noticed is I have a bit of an ugly dust spot on my sensor here. And I'm just going to grab the healing tool and just do one click on that, and that's an easy fix. And if you want to see if you've got any others that you might not have noticed, an easy way to do that is just to turn on the visualize spots checkbox down here and look through the sky. That's where they'll be most prominent, and surprisingly that was the only one, so I can press on. Now we know we're in the develop module, so I'm just going to close that down because for some reason the text, the font is huge, so we'll get rid of that. We can also press T on the keyboard, and that gets rid of this little toolbar down here as well. And as we've got nothing other than our photo in the film strip, it's probably not worth having that open either. Okay, into the masking. And Lightroom recently had a big overhaul of the way the masking works, and you can go really specific and precise with your masking, but I'm going to keep things nice and simple, hopefully, in this example. So the first one that I like to use, particularly for skies, is just to click and drag from the top of the sky, and now that's going to enable us to darken down the sky and just basically play with the top half of the sky. And so by darkening things down, that's going to start to add some of that drama back and draw our attention to the actual sunset here. We can also tweak the color if we want to. So if I want to introduce more blue into that top half of the sky, I can do that. So I may just add a little subtle shift towards the blue side. And I like to stay organized, so I name my mask layers. And that way, as we create new masks, things stay organized and we know what we're up to. So this radial mask I've put here, I'm going to use this to actually increase that clarity in the sky. And if I toggle that off and on by using the eyeball tool here, you can see what a marked difference that's having. Let's name that one as well. Now I gotta say, radial gradients are my absolute favorite masks, because if you do a nice soft fall off from the center point, which is 100% of whatever effect you're applying, to 0 where it just transitions off, if you do it large enough, it's barely noticeable, and you don't actually need to come in and do too much refinement in terms of erasing some of the mask. You can see here that there's such a long drop off between the effect and where it's meeting the sun over here. The fact that I'm bringing up the exposure over here, and that transition period is so long that you barely notice it. And if you didn't know where I'd just placed that mask, you'd have a very hard time picking out that that is the pinpoint where I've applied an effect. Okay, let's just boost up the shadows on that one as well and just see where that's helping a little bit too. Perhaps a little bit of clarity, and perhaps not quite as bright. Okay, I think the sky's looking okay. Let's deal with the sea now. So I was saying before that I'm finding it a little bit dead over here, so I may want to brighten the whole sea up and also see if I can actually introduce more of this orangey highlight onto the waves over this side. So let's see how we can do that. Naughty, naughty, I nearly didn't rename that. Okay, let's create another new mask, and again I'm going to go for a radial gradient. I was going to go for a brush to show you the difference. You know what a brush does. This is just so much easier. So I can put that right over the top of the sea. I know that we're feathering off from the bottom into the center of the sea, and that's going to help us help our viewer's eye. If I crank this all the way, you can see that we've now got this bright spot here, but the foreground of the sea that I don't really want to get brightened because I want our viewer's eye to come into the brighter parts. That's actually working to our benefit. So I'm just going to use a radial gradient instead of a brush. And as you bring the exposure up, sometimes the colour, the true colour underneath reveals itself, and it may not match the rest of your photo, particularly if it's a shadow area that you're really bringing up. And so sometimes you need to just play with these sliders and perhaps even decrease the saturation as well, just to keep that sense of believability. And along those lines, I think I've gone a little bit too bright, so I'll just bring that back down, toggle it off, very dark, broody sea, not much going on there, and now we've given it a little bit more life. Now let's see if we can't bring some orange highlights onto this bit of the sea here. We'll create a new mask, and this one's going to be a little bit more complicated. There's several ways I could handle this, to be honest, but just to do something different, I'm going to try the color range, and I can see that most of the highlights I want to pick up are in this kind of range just around here. Let's try picking that, and that's really selected far too much, so I could refine that down if I wanted to, or I could try again and pick something a little bit more accurately. There we go. Now if I want to add to that, I can do that just by bringing the refine up slightly. So what I'm doing here is making a selection that you can see in the red, but currently it's picking up a lot of the sky that I don't want and other areas as well. And so now we're going to come to this mask, and by clicking here we get these options to add to the mask or subtract from the mask. And so I want to subtract from the mask. I want to keep this sort of area through here that's going to be my highlight and take everything else away. And so I could brush it away, but what I'm going to do is with a series of linear gradients. So I'm going to click around here and start bringing this down. So everything above where I clicked is just going to disappear. Again, I can subtract from this mask by clicking and dragging over. So far so good, and now I'm going to subtract from this side here as well. So again, a linear gradient will do the job, and basically anything from where I click is going to disappear, and then we're going to get a transition into the mask to where I release. Let's go with something like that. And of course we can refine this further if we want to, once we've made our changes. So what do I want to do? I want to brighten this up so that it's more of a highlight. But just like when we brightened the sea up before, it was bringing up the color that existed in those shadows. Now we're bringing this up. If I take it even further, you can see that it's a very washed out blue right here, and we want an orange, just like we've got going on here. And I'm going to do that by taking the temperature slider and pushing that over to the right so that we're taking away the blue and adding yellow. And then we might be able to do the same by adding in some magenta. And there we go, we've got a lot more highlights showing up on the sea. Let's have a little look at our before and our after, our before and our after. And if you do feel like it's a little bit strong, like it's a little bit washed out kind of through this area here, what we can do is again subtract from that mask. And this time I am going to use a brush just so that I can be a little bit more precise. I can use my flow there and just start painting over this. And I'm currently using a mouse, so anyone can do this. I usually use a Wacom tablet, but for my tutorials I usually try and just stick to my mouse so that you guys who don't have tablets can see it's not big and scary. Anyone can do it with a mouse. Okay, let's name this mask highlights, and let's just add a couple more that are going to guide the viewer's eye a little better. And we're going to do that by brightening up the area around the sun and perhaps increasing the color temperature into that warm zone, bringing down the highlights just so that we're preserving those details. If I push this all the way to -100, so it looks really awful, you can actually see that we can still see the shape of the sun, and that's what I want. I don't want to blow this out so that you can't actually see the detail that we worked hard to preserve with our merged HDR file. And so I'm just going to introduce a little bit of negative highlights there. I'm also going to turn off these little warning dialogues here so that we can just see our sun for what it is. You can go as far with these masks as you want. So for example, I could add another one through here where we're going to just brighten up the center of the frame just ever so slightly, boost that temperature through that center part. And now what we can do is turn all of our masks off and get a good sense of what it was like before and what it's like after. And when you do this, you really get a feel for the changes that you've made and whether or not you've gone too far with certain things. So if I turn this off, you can see that our original looks a lot more saturated through this middle part here, and I really like that. And I feel like this area through here is also getting a little too bright. And so we can just come back, now that we've made all these changes, we can just fine tune our global adjustments. And that's what I'm going to do here. Just bring that exposure down slightly, maybe bring that clarity in just a tad. While I'm pleased with what we've done in the global adjustments and also the masking, the colours have got away on us just a little bit. I don't feel like they're as unified as they could be. And so to handle that, what I'm going to do is come into the colour grading section down here. And we have options to control the midtones, highlights and shadows. And more often than not, the highlights, I'm adding a nice warm colour, and the shadows I'm cooling down. And so that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to add a nice bright yellow into our highlights. We'll grab the shadows and pull those down in towards a blue, and already you can see a lot more colour harmony going on. It's a lot more visually pleasing. Things are tying in with this nice orange-blue complementary palette. In the old versions of Lightroom, this is as far as you could take it because we just had split toning, 2 tones. Now we have the option to add a third tone, which is the midtones. And I really like this because we could add a nice strong warm red, for example, and just really push that warmth of this image, or we could basically do what we want. We can take this round wherever we want, but I'm going to try and keep this more in the realms of warmth. So I'll keep this in a nice sort of warmy red orange here. So now if I come up and toggle our before and our after, you can see we've got a lot more color harmony going on. Nice complementary palette. We've got that orange blue look. Before looks quite tepid in comparison to when we turn this on. There's one more thing that we could play with, and that's the blending and the balance. So if I were to grab the balance and push that towards the right, basically we're introducing more of the highlights color into the whole photo. If I take it to the left, more of the shadow color is coming through. And where you leave that is entirely up to you, but I'm just going to have a little toggle left and right, keeping my eye on the monitor, and where I feel it should sit, that's where I'll leave it. Because I've done everything in Lightroom, I'm going to stick here for my details section where I look at the sharpening and the noise reduction, but this isn't my preferred choice. I much prefer Topaz Labs options of AI sharpening and getting rid of noise. So if you guys are interested in getting the absolute best quality out of your images, if you're sending them to print, I strongly recommend checking out the Topaz suite. I'll put a link in the description below, and if I can get a discount code, I'll let you know that as well, but it's well worth looking into. So I'll zoom into an area here at 100%, just have a look at what's going on and just play with that sharpness slider. And I quite like the idea of adding quite a lot of sharpening because it is relatively soft, this image. Add a little bit of detail here. And now as I do that, the consequence of adding that sharpening, if I turn it off and on, is that we are introducing a lot of noise into the sky here, which isn't surprising. This was shot ISO 400, so I'm going to grab the noise reduction slider here, bring that up a wee bit, and then as that softens things off, sometimes I'll come back in and just play with the sharpening and add a little bit more in. And I've got to be honest, this is coming off a 45 megapixel file, and I'm really not happy with the sharpness and the clarity of this image. This isn't one that I would be sending to print in its current state. I would definitely be running this through Topaz. If you want to go even further with your color grading, you can absolutely do that in the develop section, coming into the camera calibration, and you could, for example, grab the blue primary and take that to the left. Moving the green primary up a little might help us too. It really depends on the look that you're going for, but if I toggle the before and then the after, you can certainly play with the richness of the colors and the slight subtle shifts of the hues. Let's go somewhere in between what we've created there. Okay, so let's call this our final edit, and now let's do my favorite thing to do, which is to press the \/ key, which enables us to see our before and our after. This is our before, this is our after. So that's our edit, and I'm pretty pleased with it, but I wouldn't be sending that off to print because I'm literally printing things out this big. This is an average canvas size for something that I'm printing. So the level of detail that's required in prints like this and bigger, which I'm also often doing for office spaces and people's showers behind their kitchen splashbacks, things like that, you need to have that detail and clarity there. And that's why I'd strongly recommend checking out Topaz Labs. Links below, check out what we can do with it. You're going to be amazed. So I'm going to start with Topaz Denoise and open that up. And from here, we browse to our photo of the sunset. And in the top left view, we see 100% representation of our photograph. And it's best to zoom to an area where you have some noise, have some detail. And then Denoise AI will render 3 other versions for you. And as you can see, all 3 of them do a really good job of removing the noise that we have in our original. And it's just up to us to select the version that we like. So if we choose standard, we just save the image out. A 16-bit TIFF is fine. And then Denoise AI will go about processing our image and save it into that folder. From here, I'll load up Sharpen AI, open the photo that we just worked on. Same interface as before. Top left, we've got the original, and then we've got 3 alternate versions based on different AI algorithms. And the motion blur is not relevant to us because the photo is not blurry due to motion. It's also not really out of focus. It's just a little bit too soft. So I'll select this and again, save our image. And now I'm opening my favorite of the 3, which is 𝗥𝗲𝗡𝗧 AI. This is a truly fantastic bit of software. The very compressed version in the bottom left is doing a particularly good job. If I bring this up side by side, and as we let 𝗥𝗲𝗡𝗧 AI do its calculations, pay particular attention to the light source that we have here. As that pops, you can see that all of a sudden, what was just a bit of a blurry mess, the AI has worked out somehow that this is some sort of lamppost, and the wires that were in the background as well, they've been re-rendered. If we look at the original upscaled version here on the left, you can see that it's pretty ugly, a lot of artifacts, you can still see the pixels, whereas on the right hand side here, the AI has done a really good job of intelligently finding objects, making outlines, and overall refining our image and adding a lot of detail and clarity. Okay, we're really zoomed in on what will ultimately be a meter wide canvas at 300 pixels per inch. So I know that this is going to print with absolute perfection. Even if it looks like there's a little bit of artifacting or anything like that, it's going to be so much better and a better print than what's here, the original on the left. And this is after we've already run Denoise and Sharpen AI as well. But on the right hand side, as soon as we introduce 𝗥𝗲𝗡𝗧 and blow the image up to the size we want, this is an absolute game changer, people. So I'm going to export this. If you guys want to know more and would like me to do a video specifically on these Topaz tools, please let me know in the comments. But for now, I'll leave you with our finished image from today. And right now there's another video of mine popping up on screen. It's something that YouTube's algorithm thinks may be of interest to you. So if it is, go ahead and click that, and I'll see you in that video. Thanks for watching.